Hey, all, welcome to the Oddly Successful Podcast, which is a podcast where we celebrate people who have followed their instincts, went against the grain, and found success outside of the traditional path. I'm your host, Alexander Lefebvre Dietrich, and as always, before we begin, I want to remind you that you can find our episodes on YouTube and Instagram outside of your traditional podcast platforms just by following at Oddly Successful. So today, I have the great pleasure of interviewing Alex Zorychta, and he's a managing partner at Not Yet Ventures, which I'm sure we'll be talking about a bunch. He has so far coached 16 startups. That's a lot. Coached 16 startups from pre-idea to YC and Techstars. Funding, has worked with thousands of university students and entrepreneurs for the past 12 years in various capacities, including AWS startups and the University of Virginia. So now, when I was reading some of what you got, Alex, first of all, welcome. It's great to have you. You bet. I was reading a little bit of what you had here, and it sounds like a lot of your journey started when you were a student entrepreneur. So can you tell us about that, like the beginnings of from where you're at now?
Yeah, that's probably the best place to start because none of it makes sense unless you start. If you'd asked me from the beginning if I'd be doing what I'm doing now, I would have thought you're crazy. I was going to college. I studied engineering, biomedical engineering, which
Okay.
I hated math in high school. So what? I don't know. I did that because I wanted to like make things that would
Yeah.
some sort of impact in the world, as most young people do.
Mhm.
And I thought engineering would be the way to do it because you're like building something that solves a problem that's real. I also loved like the brain and biology and all that. Um, and so I got on this independent research team. We were building devices using synthetic biology, and it's like this international competition called iGEM, where like there's like a world jamboree and everything. And so we were building this device that the idea was to create a pregnancy test that detected bacterial infection instead of just pregnancy. So super cheap,
Interesting.
off the shelf, able to be used in a couple of minutes to see if you had whatever bacteria that you're looking for, whether it be
Mhm.
like whooping cough, STDs, cholera, E. coli, 157, the stuff that's in like ground beef.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so we did that, and like coming back off of like a year of working on that, and we presented the Jamboree, like it was
Mhm.
essentially a science project. But then, our university, University of Virginia, if you can't tell where I went, that's actually where I went.
Okay. Yeah. I see it pasted on the wall in the background there. Yeah.
That's right. They offered this competition where like all you had to do was have a crazy idea. They're like, "Do you have a
Mm.
crazy idea for something that's going to change the world?" And I was like, "Yeah, we
Yeah.
do. We
Yeah.
totally do." They're like, "You could win a $20,000, cash prize for this," which is a lot of money back then. It still is a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so yeah, we were like, "Yeah, we're engineers. We could business people. People like what is business? These undergrads, they go and they study business because they don't want to do work in college, right? That was the engineers hubris coming out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, we entered that competition, and through that realized that like creating a business out of this or a business plan was the next step if you
Mm.
wanted to get a device actually out there having real impact. Because unless it's commercially successful, most things don't actually get out there and have impact. So,
Yeah.
anyways, long story short, we ended up winning. It was this crazy success story that's like those '90s like movies like Mighty Ducks. Like I don't know, it wasn't that. It was that
Yeah.
exciting.
Like matching jerseys, bowl cuts, the whole thing. Yeah.
I had a bowl cut when I was little, but thankfully not in
Me
college.
too. Me too.
So yeah, we won, and then there was a bunch of people there to help us. We ended up getting this like research grant that allowed us to go and pursue it, and I
Mm.
was off to the races as student entrepreneur there. I can keep going, but I'll stop there because all you asked about was student entrepreneur.
I mean, no, I really want to keep going down this thread, but like, I think the first question that I have is, and let me know if I got this right. You mentioned it
Yeah.
was like a pregnancy test that tested for certain infections. Why, like why that in particular of everything I'm sure that you can do with biomedicine? What attracted you to that specific, manifestation of trying to help people in the medical field?
That's a great question. So the idea was you needed to genetically modify bacteria.
Hmm.
in order to do something, to create a device. So other people were creating like cameras where like certain light colors were going onto this petri dish and with a
Hmm.
mask, and it would like create an image. The bacteria would grow with certain colors. So if
Hmm.
red light came on, it would make red protein, blue protein. Other people were doing something more useful, like making it so that cells could manufacture this really rare cancer medicine, like I think it's called artemisinin, which is it
Hmm.
grows on these trees in the Amazon or somewhere else endangered. These trees they take 200 years to grow, so it's not really you can't really get it from nature. But they were thinking about having easily available materials that the bacteria could eat, and then their modified digestive processes, basically output the artemisinin. And so we were thinking up really cool, crazy ideas. If you can't tell, it's a very creative competition. I
Yeah,
really think we
yeah.
do it for you. If you look at iGEM, IGEM online, they're still doing
I,
things like that.
all right,
Um,
okay.
and so we were thinking, we were all like sort of researching stuff and coming up with ideas because it was a team of like seven of us.
Hmm.
And one of the things we wanted to do was we were looking at bacterial viruses called bacteriophage. Um,
Hmm.
Therapy that got really big in like Russia in like the 1920s or so.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of research done during the Soviet Union around the same time that like we were also doing antibiotic research over in the United States, the Western
Hmm.
world. And so obviously one of them is much more prominent than the other. And due to, I mean, I'm not the expert on this, but due to a lot of political reasons, the
Hmm.
bacteriophage therapy, which is you can like target certain bacteria killing them, kind of like antibiotics do, but in a different way. That wasn't really touched. So we decided to try to like revive
Hmm.
that and be like, what if we modified these bacterial viruses so that they could more effectively go after, bacterial illnesses? We
Huh.
pretty quickly realized that we couldn't do that, but what we
Okay.
could do was modify them in a way where you could detect that the bacteria is there. And then we wanted to
Hmm.
make it so it's pretty easily accessible. And we were like, the pregnancy test is easily accessible. I actually found out through my research that you can find them for $1 or less at your dollar store and at Walmart, and you can get a lot of them up at once for
Well,
scientific testing purposes. So yeah, so that's how
dang.
we got on that idea. It was a blast, but it was a lot of fun.
That's insane. I mean, like, because it sounds like there is the medical side of it, which just based off of the variables that you're saying, like, yeah, you can. I mean, even all these different ways to detect or kill bacteria, right? You can do it with viruses. You can do it with light therapy. You can do it. I mean, with just so many different ways, and then you take that and you combine it with, I'll call it a medium, right? Whether that is like a pregnancy test or whether it's some sort of, I don't know, I'm thinking like a blood diagnostic to where you can enumerate it, things like that. I mean, just the ability to pair different ways in medicine, like it almost breaks it down to something that's more tangible for the average user. So um, that's wild. So you came up with this idea to be able to detect bacterial infections, and you won this grant, and I think you stopped around there, but you became the student entrepreneur. Where did that take you? Did you launch that product, or did it like just kind of take you on this unexpected route that led you somewhere else?
Yeah, so the entrepreneurial ecosystems that we now have around the
Hmm.
country these days were not nearly as mature back then.
Hmm.
I guess unless you're like Stanford or somewhere in Boston or something like that. And so we got as far as to be able to do that, but we didn't actually go out and talk to customers. It turns
Hmm.
out that like if you want to have a business, it's kind of like one of the first things you need to do. And so I like to think that that was my really hard lesson,
Hmm.
which I is the first thing I use when I work with student entrepreneurs, all entrepreneurs these days, is
Hmm.
that it doesn't really matter about the technology, right?
Hmm.
Again, engineers hubris, right? We were like, we're the ones building it. It's got to be the technology that's the hardest. That's actually the easy part compared to
Hmm.
trying to figure out who wants it, who's going to pay for it, how do you actually get it out there and
Yep.
sell it. And so, yeah, we spent basically 2 years going and building the thing and getting it to work. It did work at the end of the day, but then it was pretty clear that we first built it for E. coli for like food
Hmm.
safety, like beef and all that. It
Yeah.
turns out that like the problem we could have been solving with a point of use, cheap consumer like pregnancy test type thing, that's not why people are getting sick from like
Hmm.
beef bacterial outbreaks. That's
Yeah.
not right. And
Yeah.
so within a few conversations that we could have had, honestly, like 2 years prior, um,
Hmm.
we realized that that just wasn't going to work out. But also, I had grown as a person and started to
Hmm.
realize that I didn't actually like being in a lab all day pipetting liquids into other liquids. Right? So, um,
That's
you know,
fair.
yeah. So it didn't really turn out to be anything there, but it gave me the tools necessary to actually start helping younger student entrepreneurs who, could go as far as I did, me and my team, and actually go further because they implemented some of the lessons that I had learned.
So, I mean, it sounds like, as you mentioned, like the big lesson, right, is getting out there and talking to people, and you're helping a lot of student entrepreneurs now. I mean, my guess is that like, hey, you're coming to me. This is the first thing I'm going to tell you, or like, what's some of the advice that you're giving some of these student entrepreneurs now?
Yeah, honestly, that is the advice I tell them in various ways. Um, so so basically, there's an accelerator called Y Combinator that is probably the most
Okay.
famous, most successful early stage accelerator in the world. And the founder, Paul Graham, has
Hmm.
been writing about his philosophy of like how you do startups in the early days, how he
Hmm.
coaches startups like since probably the early 2000s. And
Hmm.
his essays are still on the website out there. And he's got this one called Do Things That Don't Scale that I think perfectly encapsulates a lot of these lessons
Hmm.
in a way that most entrepreneurs they're going to see it a lot more than like some of the scientists that I deal with. So basically, what he says is like go out there and you need to find that one customer, figure out what they want, and do everything you can to provide whatever value that you're trying to build for them is. Don't build the
Hmm.
software first. Build just enough to do the things for them that they need. So like instead of spending time like building a sign up screen or a login screen or like this like wireframes, go figure out what they need and try to do as much of that manually as possible. If someone's
Yeah.
willing to pay you for that, you can then figure out ways to automate the things because software is
Hmm.
automating things that you would have to do manually. You start to get a sense of people actually would want something like that.
Yeah.
Um, and there's also a book it's a little pamphlet called Talking to Humans that I
Hmm.
highly recommend. And there's another book called The Mom Test, which is very similar about how you
Yes. Yeah,
go
I've
out
read
there
that one.
and see if
Yep.
people want this without having to build it and without
Hmm.
getting maybe some wrong information from people who like just want you to go away. They're like, oh yeah, it's a great idea. I totally pay for that.
Yeah.
Um, so that's often my first thing that I tell people to do,
Yeah.
and either they go do it or they don't, right? So yeah, that's my first advice.
Well, it's so funny because as you were talking, the mom test is literally in my head, and one of the questions that I had was, as I think a lot of people can be very protective of their ideas. They're like, "Hey, I have this amazing idea." They think so, and I want to bring it to market. And but in the back of their mind, it's just like, not so much is my idea going to be helpful, but more so, I want to share how amazing my idea is when they're starting to talk to people, and that can kind of lead conversations. Um, so I guess when you're talking to some of these students, is that, maybe a lesson, it's like, hey, you're gonna have to figure that on your own, or do you have anything that you tell students that's like, hey, how do you ask the right questions and be totally open to the feedback that's ultimately going to make you successful?
Right. Well, I'd say that people place way too much emphasis on the ideas themselves,
Mm,
right? Again, I go back to Paul Graham from Y Combinator. One of his quotes that he has is that the best ideas often initially look like bad ideas.
hmm.
But just think of like a lot of the companies that are out there that ended up
Okay.
doing really well. Most people
Yeah.
discounted them at the beginning. I
Hmm.
mean, like Airbnb, it was like we already had vacation rental things. I think they even had it online, right?
Yeah.
And like, are you thinking that someone's actually going to like want somebody to stay in the house when they're there with a spare room, right? Some like random stranger off the internet. Like, is this really going to be a big deal? And there's a lot out there on how hard it was for Airbnb to actually communicate, what they were doing and for people to believe in them. Even after going through Y Combinator,
Hmm.
they had like one investor that was maybe interested in what they're doing. And now
Yeah.
they're the most valuable company out of Y Combinator. I think it like 30 billion or so, valuation at this point and climbing. So
I didn't know they went through Y Combinator. That's
yeah.
wild.
I mean, think
Huh.
about like also Snapchat. So Snap didn't go through Y Combinator, but like Snapchat blew up, obviously.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
at the time, what they were offering was an app that you took a picture, you sent it to your friend, and then it disappeared. And it's like, why is that valuable? We already have text messaging where like you can send a video or a picture and you get to keep it. Why the hell would you
Yeah.
want it to disappear? Right? Looks like a bad idea. Um, and that thing took off. So, placing too much emphasis on the idea in the beginning is actually a terrible thing, because even if
Mhm.
it is the best idea in the world, you're probably, or it ends up being the best idea, you're probably initially what you're working on actually is not exactly right, right? Unless
Mhm.
you're like super lucky. And so you sort of have to operate with the assumption that something is fundamentally flawed about it, and going out there and validating it from the customers. If they are actually paying you for it, right? You actually have a little bit more signal that you're onto something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it sounds like I like this word experiment that you have, right? Like it almost becomes a scientific process where, like as in my experience formerly as a product manager, there was this idea of like, you have this idea and you want to list out all of your assumptions that you have about the idea, which can be pretty humbling to do when you realize how many assumptions you're running off of. And when you start ordering, like, all right, which one of these could make or break the business versus which ones are smaller, you can begin to design tests around that, and go out and validate or disvalidate. I don't know the word, right? But figure out if you're on the right path. So, anyway, so you mentioned like as you're teaching these students, is there like I guess a structure to this curriculum? I mean, it sounds like you're working with them a lot. Is there like kind of like a 1, 2, 3 step that you do, or like a program that you have, or is it just more like a very conversational mentorship? How does that look like in your day to day?
A lot of what I prioritize first is the relationship. I want to
Hmm.
understand that person, see them as a human, right?
Hmm.
Because I don't actually consider myself an expert in anything other than the process itself.
Hmm.
Um, and going back to the idea real quick, if I could identify what the best ideas were from the beginning, I would be a billionaire many times
Yeah.
over already, right? So anyone
Hmm.
who pretends like they can vet the idea from the beginning is a fool. I mean, I'll go
Yeah.
that far and say it's a fool, right? So
Yeah.
we have to progress together. Let's partner up
Hmm.
together and let's go out and do the process to actually figure out if this idea is actually good,
Yeah.
or bad. Now, I wish there was a process, right? The thing about entrepreneurship teaching is like it's very hard to actually have a step-by-step curriculum other
Hmm.
than the basic things. It's like, go out and talk to customers, only bet what you can afford to lose, try to get commitments from people,
Hmm.
to join you. So here's one thing that we can do is, so you go out and talk to the customer and
Hmm.
you sort of try to move them down this commitment continuum. Hopefully they will pay you at the end of it. But if they
Hmm.
just respond to your message, that's a positive, right? If they give
Yeah.
you 15 minutes of time to do an interview with you, that's a positive. If they
Hmm.
agree to have a follow-up interview, like that's a positive. If they
Yeah.
agree to be on the little listserv where you send out little updates, right, with it, that's a positive. If they want to help you co-create the idea, that's a positive. If they'll be a
Yeah.
pilot, that's a positive, right?
Yeah.
Or if they'll introduce you to someone. You're sort of like getting these little commitments down the line. And what's cool is that every single step that you take towards this idea, the more people you talk to, the more it changes, and the more assets, I guess, for lack of a better term, you have at your
Okay.
disposal to run the company. It's not just you with an idea up here; it's you
Hmm.
having gone out there in the world, and
Hmm.
opportunities come your way. So a lot of what I'm doing is building this relationship, talking about what's coming at us, what we've learned, and then sort of seeing which opportunity has come our way might be the most interesting to go after, and then obviously coming back and reevaluating in the next conversation.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, I'm wondering too, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I'm almost thinking like as you get, you mentioned, was it a commitment continuum is how you phrased
You
it?
think of it, yeah.
Um, like as you get this, see where people are willing to commit to, I almost think of it as like a click-through rate, right? If you maybe see a drop off at a certain point, you can be like, well, hey, maybe there's something here
Mhm.
that we need to fix. So you're almost limiting the variables that you have to work with to start building like these more focused experiments.
That's right. The best things often, and this goes back to Paul Graham's article, do things that don't scale, right? You
Hmm.
start off with like the one customer and you're with them every step of the journey. In fact, you're probably acting like the software would to
Hmm.
make this happen. And so you get to fix all of these things that are in the way, start automating it. Then you can start
Hmm.
to handle the second, the third, the fifth, the 10th, the 50th customer, right? And you start to
Yeah.
get to the point at which it's scaled, and you would design it right as you go, fixing things. in a way that you never could have even, I guess you could get lucky, but never could have guessed at from the beginning when it was just a theory in your mind.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering too, like especially with the as you had mentioned, like the difficulty to structure an entrepreneurship curriculum, and especially with like, I mean, it sounds like, everybody says like, oh, you should be welcoming failure. It almost gets cliche to this point, but it sounds like, well, failure is good because if you can measure specifically how and where that failure occurred, that begins to, again, to give you more focus as to what you're doing. But how do you, like, as you're teaching students, and you mentioned you'd been working in some schools and some companies helping starting entrepreneurs. How do you, as a facilitator, answer to maybe some of these bigger entities saying like, hey, there may not be a very tangible dollar figure coming in from some of these students. However, there is value in the process that they're going through to figure out that answer.
Yeah, I mean, if you can figure that out, let me know because I don't think I've. Um, part of the
Yeah.
problem of trying to put this kind of learning into the system of education that we have, and I'm trying not to go
Mhm.
down too many rabbit holes here, is it just doesn't quite fit. So we've got
Yeah.
this really interesting, I guess, local maxima where it's kind of working, where
Mhm.
this is my cynical version of it. I mean, these universities and educational institutions, they love entrepreneurship because it's synonymous with
Mhm.
innovation.
Yes.
They like to position themselves as leaders in the rankings for entrepreneurship. They like to make a big show of having large buildings. They like to show that they have a massive curriculum with many classes,
Mhm.
interdisciplinary with professors, maybe even professors of practice who are teaching various things, maybe even like different like avenues of entrepreneurship that are out there. And students will take it because by getting those credentials, they are seen as innovative and they may
Yeah.
be more hireable to the companies that are hiring them, right? That's all
Mhm.
well and good. The problem is that's not really how entrepreneurship works. If you
Mm.
expect to go into a classroom or a university or go into one of these spaces that are beautiful, like entrepreneurship centers, and come out the other way as an entrepreneur, it doesn't work like that.
Mm.
Imagine trying to go to a school that teaches like music, right, for musicians,
Yep.
and then trying to be the next, I don't know, like Coldplay or Taylor Swift. It just doesn't
Yeah.
work.
Yep.
Trying to be the next like author, trying to be the next famous actress in Hollywood, like it just doesn't work. There are so
Mhm.
many other things that are unique to your journey that just cannot be supplied to you. Now, is it totally useless? No. I think that there's vocabulary that you need to
Mhm.
get to understand to be an entrepreneur. You need to know sort of how corporations are structured, like what good co-founders look like, maybe get some case studies. You can network with other people who are interested in stuff. So it's valuable, but it's not the only thing. And just, full disclosure, like I've been on all sides of this. I was a professor actually teaching intro to entrepreneurship at the University of
Mhm.
Virginia. Um, and so like there's it's valuable, but it's definitely not the entire thing that you need to be
Yeah.
an entrepreneur.
Well, it's I'm happy you brought up the music thing. So I went to a visual arts school to do like 2D and 3D concept art for games and movies, and very quickly do you, and hopefully, and by the way, if anybody's in art school, I hope you listen to this as somebody who's been through this. The degree is not going to get you a job. It's just not, right? Because exactly what you're saying, like it's very comfortable, I think, for folks to be like, hey, I checked this box, I did this class, I did this assignment, bang, 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 and like hit these measurable ticks, which feel good because it gives you this illusion of accomplishment. And I use illusion as, very distinctly. Um, and again, it's not that they don't have utility, but they're derivative of the original the original core of what makes somebody a good artist or what makes somebody a good entrepreneur. Like, yeah, you want to get those ticks, but not just to do that, but because in the process of exploring and learning, genuinely, those other things are going to naturally come. It's almost like you're putting the cart before the horse.
That's exactly right. You know what's interesting is like you think back to the original concept of the university. I'm thinking of like Raphael's painting of like
Yep,
Percy, the
yep,
school of Athens.
yep.
Um, the idea was that everybody is a student, right? It's
Mm,
just because you're older or more experienced in something doesn't mean that you're better than them. It's just more of like you know a little bit more than them in that one subject that's there. And
Mhm.
so I think really, where most people's eye is on what can the professor teach me and what can this textbook talk to me about and what can I learn from mentors who have made it. Um, and what they really should be looking at is what can my fellow students teach me? And
Mhm.
so the way that I coach entrepreneurs is I act, as a, hey, I'm a facilitator of this. I want to teach you things that I've seen, but I also want to connect you to other people who like literally just did whatever you're trying to do because they can help you way better. And going back to the way you and I met, Alex, it
Yeah.
was through like a Richmond connection, right?
Yep. Yeah.
There's Lighthouse Labs. The
Mhm.
founder of Lighthouse Labs, I think he was the founder, Todd Knuckles, what he used to
Yep.
say was that entrepreneurs learn best from those who are 15 minutes ahead of them.
Hmm.
And so using that, like that's how I encourage my entrepreneurs to learn entrepreneurship. And so the only thing that I can do for them really, I think, is be the manager of that process that they're doing, which is go talk to
Mhm.
customers, only build for customers like when you know they need something, just build enough to get that value out there, and then just keep layering on there, and that's how you'll get to the successful startup at the end of the day.
Hmm. Well, you also mentioned like this idea of having, and I quote, an insane amount of blind faith to actually find success. And it sounds like, a lot of what you're saying is, hey, again, not just ticking boxes, but like really throwing yourself out to the wind and seeing, being paying attention, right? But seeing where that leads to. It's a very amorphous, I would argue, ordeal that people have to go through that doesn't really have a plain view in sight.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's kind of what I've been experiencing this entire time. Along the way, like I didn't mean to be doing what I'm doing. In fact, if I was smart, I probably would have just gone and done something that pays me well for my time.
Mhm.
I like to think I could do many different things. Um, but there's enough risk that happens in entrepreneurship that like why make it harder on yourself?
Yeah.
One of kind of controversial pieces that I tell founders these days is that you really shouldn't be dropping out and focusing full time on your business idea. Like
Mm.
that very rarely works. Like
Mhm.
what you want to do is be able to save up enough in reserves so that you have multiple shots, as many shots on goal as you can, right? So
Mhm.
this means like if you're a student, don't drop out to pursue a startup if it's still an idea, right?
Mhm.
Have that full-time thing and then work in that spare time with people that you like on problems that you like. And if the thing takes on a life of its own so much that you literally cannot stay in school, then yeah, for sure, go after that
Yep.
startup, right? But
Yep.
very few people have that happen to them. And so, having that blind faith, you definitely need that. But it's a lot easier to have when you're also not trying to fight for your own survival,
Yeah.
identity, whatever the company is. There's enough of that in chaos later down the road that you
Yeah.
don't need that when literally there's no money coming in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you think about if a person is so desperate for that income to support them, it, it it almost sounds like there needs to be this acceptance that building a business, vetting an idea is going to be a long-term process unless you're extremely lucky. And again, if we take a look at like all the assumptions that we had mentioned hypothetically beforehand, like pretty much all those things have to come into a line. And unless you're knocking every single one of those, it's probably not going to stick. So you're talking like a one in millions of chances to get perfect that first time. And unless there's that acceptance of like, hey, you're going to have to try things and shave down some of those variables and make some of those experiences to really narrow your scope of focus, and that's just going to take time and reps. Um, to not have that runway and to dedicate yourself to the wrong thing too soon, I can only imagine is pretty detrimental.
Oh, that's very right. I imagine there's like two schools of thought here. In some ways, being hungry and desperate makes you in some ways more likely to take the leaps you need in order to
Mm-hmm.
like make it work. So like that's
Yep.
definitely a path, but that's not the path I would choose. That is so stressful, right? I find that the coolest ideas, or the way that the startups evolve to have some of the coolest ideas, are those where the person has enough like mental capacity and bandwidth to be able to actually evaluate some opportunities in there, where
Hmm.
they're able to be creative. The pressure is off to take just the quick win, and they can
Hmm.
really like sort of go towards where they're drawn to, right? They have the luxury of multiple options.
Hmm.
This is where we get into creativity.
Yeah.
I've become more in this technical field, of creativity, since I started working with entrepreneurs,
Yeah.
because of the mindsets and tools that they make. I'm actually on the board of the Creative Education Foundation, who have a lot of
Huh.
these tools that are there now. And a big part of creativity is this ability to like, take ownership and have this internal motivation and drive and space to think and
Hmm.
incubate the ideas instead of just
Yeah.
boom, boom, boom executing on them.
You
So
know, it's just kind of as an aside, there's a book I have to stand by about creativity. I'm looking it up right now because I've actually started reading this, The Creative Act: A Way of Being. That's the name of the book, by Rick Rubin. Um, and I've been reading this book, and what I found, in case like the guitars and stuff in the background haven't given it away, like I like to play music. And one of the things that I had personally struggled with in the arts is like this expectation that I need to have something like now. Like when I sit down with this guitar, a song has to come out of it. Sometimes that's not how it works. Sometimes you just have to play around with something, and then you step away and you go for a walk. You're in the shower 3 days later, you're like, oh, I'm kind of jamming to this in a different way. Now let me go back and play with that. So you use the word incubation, that kind of uh, triggered that. But you'd also mentioned this word, playing, in the
right.
sense of entrepreneurship. Yeah, if you want to expand on that, I think that would be pretty cool because
That's right. That's the
yeah.
ideal mindset to be in. It's play. Do you remember when you were a kid? I'm talking to the audience, like not,
Yeah.
but remember when you were a kid and like you made up the coolest things with your friends. Like
Yeah.
imagine that euphoria, that feeling, and you weren't trying to make the perfect game that's going to be so awesome and get investment and start making money. You're just trying to make the most fun game to play with your
Yeah.
friends. Taking that feeling, right? Taking that
Hmm.
process of working with people that you love to work with and working on things that you like to work on or build, like that is the job of the entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And so you're more likely to become outcome independent, right? Maybe that's a way we can phrase this.
Mm.
You're more likely to do that when like the pressure is off for you to survive. Um,
Mm.
but you can also just as easily like not make it into anything because the pressure is off, and that's okay too. But
Yeah.
you definitely need to be in this mindset of play if you really want to have I think the best time in trying to build your own venture.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because years ago I had met somebody. So I was in between jobs. I was helping my friend being a wedding DJ, and one of the bridesmaids and I we were just talking, and she had her own business, like brokering horses. And I was like, "How did you get into that?" She's like, "I just always grew up with horses, and then like I had one, and I found a better owner for it, so I sold it. And then they're like, well, hey, I'll give you like these two horses too. I'm like, well, I can't feed one of them, but I know somebody who does. And like, it was just in this process of just being in their space. And I'll even shout out kind of what we're doing here. So by accepting this place that you're in and accepting your interests and just, again, not having this expectation, but just enjoying where you're at, a lot of entrepreneurs that I've met almost fall into quote unquote entrepreneurship. It's like something that, yeah, they worked for, but in the same regard, it just kind of happened by life circumstance.
That's right. That's how a lot of it happens. It's kind of this, I work with a lot of young people working with student
Hmm.
entrepreneurs, and many of them they think they're looking for entrepreneurship as a way to like, do more of what they like, but I just encourage them to, don't worry about the business side, just do more of what you like. A lot of them are searching
Yeah.
for identity or what their purpose is, and so many of them are I almost say it's like Googling it. They're trying to like figure out what the keywords are to search for their purpose and have it just show up, right?
Yeah.
And I think someone's purpose or mission, it's discovered, it's unearthed. It's you like look
Hmm.
at your habits and the things you're drawn to, the things that pique your curiosity. You need to sort of research and investigate yourself in order to find out what you really like doing and should do more of, instead of
Hmm.
trying to like transplant what other people think are amazing onto you. We see this a lot with like people who aren't interested in coding or like software, but like want to build like a software
Yeah.
startup, right? You can do it. You can find a co-founder that's a coder, right? But it's probably you're more a lot more indicated that you're going to do that if you're already building software that solves problems for people.
Well, I think I'd be interested to get your thoughts on like hustle culture right now because it almost and I know we hadn't talked about this before, but if you're comfortable, like
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm curious about what you feel about that.
Yeah, I don't like it because it puts you out of this mindset of play, out of
Hmm.
creativity, out of this thing that you're gonna need to have long term, and into the short term grind set that
Yeah.
it's just not sustainable. As someone, I went through in high school a pretty rigorous competitive program called IB, which is
Hmm.
it's like AP, but you get less credits for it in college. I don't know why I did it, but overachievers, right? You get engineering, and we're like staying up late at night, grinding, trying to get, the A's to look the best for like the grad school or like
Yeah.
the good employers that are out there. And then that translates over into entrepreneurship. You start wearing the candle down, you start losing yourself, right? You get
Yeah.
lost in the mission of the results. And you never really
Hmm.
question yourself of like, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
Um, I don't think it's healthy. Now I say, working hard is healthy. You shouldn't be lazy, right? You should be
Hmm.
continually sort of pursuing this stuff, but just saying that you should be working 80 hours a week on something to generate money for money's sake is I don't think a healthy way of living your life.
Yeah, well, we had actually on the previous episode we had a guest who was or who is a Marine infantry officer and firefighter, and he was saying about there'd be times when he was going to test and he was pulling 12-hour days because he'd be driving 5 hours one way to take a 2-hour test and then drive 5 hours back, which unless you really want to do that is it was still hard work, but there was like this internal sense of like, yeah, I'm doing this because I want to get to this next level that really means something to me. Um, and so I hear like this, yeah, you got to pull these crazy amount of hours. I mean, sometimes, yeah, but I think it's a different story or a different feeling that's like, if you're truly aligned, as, kind of woo as that sounds, but if you're truly aligned to what you're supposed to be doing, it's so much easier to accept that. It's I would argue almost enjoyable sometimes
Yeah.
to accept that challenge for yourself.
No, that's right. And so, we're kind of talking about entrepreneurship in the way of like, oh, wouldn't it be nice to, be the next Steve Jobs, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's kind of a luxury, right, to be able to
Yeah.
do this kind of stuff. Now, like, if you need to do this, right? If you need to do this to support your family and like,
Hmm.
be like grinding it out, that's one thing, right? Then absolutely, you do what it takes to get to where you need to be sustainable. But if like you don't need to undergo that amount of stress that's out there, like I just don't think it's worth it, right?
Yeah.
Instead, you should be playing with people that are, you like working with and building stuff that you like working on. And that
Yeah.
stuff may end up being something really cool. It's more likely to end up being cool, or just may end up just being fun memories with your friends.
Yeah.
Um,
100.
taking the
100%.
pressure off and like actually one of the first things I say to a lot of student entrepreneurs is like, it's okay. You don't need to be an entrepreneur, right? But if it happens, if you happen to find some sort of like gold vein, where people are coming to you and asking for more of it, then like absolutely, let's go. It may not be now, it may be in 5 years, 10 years, but you know that I'm here to back you up whenever
Yeah.
the time is right. But yeah, well, life is hard enough. Why make it more chaotic, right? Like
Well,
that gets me to something else, right? Where like
yeah.
I think this concept of enough, like what is enough? We always want to have
Mm.
more. They're like, if only I can have that, then I'll be fine. I want that Porsche, right? I want the nice house. I want the college degree. I want this job that's here. I want to get married or whatever it is. Well, the feeling that you get when you actually have that is never as satisfying as the journey to get there. Um,
Hmm.
well, at least like the longing for it. And so, being to the point where you actually do have enough, right? And like practicing gratitude, right?
Hmm.
Actually will allow you to do the things to get more, right? Because it's no longer like a necessity. It's more of like a wow, this is kind of a cool thing that I get to maybe strive for and can get to. But I want to love the process, getting up, going, and doing the work every day.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious. Have you ever, like, on a side note, have you ever seen? There's a traveling like science museum exhibit that's going around, and I think they held it Recently at the Richmond Science Museum, The Science of Happiness.
Oh, I haven't seen this. No, tell me more.
I think they do it every year, so you should check it out. Anybody who's watching this, if it comes near, should check it out. But one of the things that was so enlightening to me that you just touched on was like they were literally showing that when people achieve whatever it is that they're trying to achieve, like yes, there's a sudden spike in the neurotransmitters that make them feel happy, but they return to their baseline like immediately afterwards. So you get this very fleeting high when you get to whatever that goal is. But for those that are able to just have a more positive, gracious, or grateful outlook on life, those levels of those neurotransmitters that keep them feeling good and positive and give them the energy to go after that, allow them to have more of those successful outputs, and the spikes aren't as extreme, something like that, right? But basically what they're saying is it's more so your outlook on the current situation that you have in your life that's going to give you the energy and the ability to go after those things that you want to achieve versus having this expectation that, well, if I achieve this, then I'll be able to get this next thing, then I'll be able to get this next thing. It's like, no, it's way more in your control.
That's exactly right. I mean, all these kind of things are tying together.
Yeah.
The best framework for entrepreneurship I found that kind of rolls this stuff in is one that's homegrown in the UVA Darden network. There's
Okay. Yeah.
Sarah Sarasvathy. She came up with effectuation, which
Hmm.
she describes it as 5 principles. Um, I've never found a good way to explain it in a short bit, so I'm not gonna try to explain it there. But a lot of it's
Okay.
maybe the best way to capture it is like instead of looking out there at a destination and trying to figure out what the best way to get to that right answer is down the road, you actually anchor yourself with you. Who am I?
Hmm.
Who do I know? What do I know? And what for the next step, like what am I interested in and what can I afford to lose to get there to see if I want to take the step further from that, right?
Hmm.
You're sort of like growing out there, you're building commitments, but nowhere in here is the idea, right?
Yeah.
Nowhere in your principles is the concept of the idea. That kind of comes about from the actions that you take and the commitments you get from other people.
Yeah. Well, I like this phrase that you use, like, what can I afford to lose? There's a term in the entrepreneurship and in the business community that I think gets misinterpreted. It's calculated risk,
Yeah.
right? And I think a lot of times when people hear that, at least me for the longest time, I'd hear calculated risk and think like, all right, well, there's like a 60% chance that I'm going to get everything, I'm going to lose it all, and like 60% is good odds. But that's nothing more than gambling. Versus what you were saying is like, all right, well, every step of the way, you think if I go route A or route B or route C, I could lose this much, or this much, and what is my tolerance for that? And if things don't go out the way as planned, like, am I still going to be okay to maybe take that other shot that we were talking about earlier?
That's right. That's funny. I actually do liken it to gambling because the way in which I've always
Yeah,
responsibly gone to the casino is, hey, I'm gonna take this like I don't know, $50 or something like
yeah,
that. And like I'm gonna go and I'm gonna play and I'm gonna have fun. And I could
yep,
either make more or I could spend this, right? But it is an
yep,
expense. And as soon as
yep.
I lose that $50 that I'm gonna lose, I'm not gonna say, I can reach in my pocket and get more. It's like, nope, that's it, I'm out,
That's
right?
it. You're done. Yeah.
I mean, along the way, it's like, yeah, sure, I lost that, but I'm okay with it because there was that
Hmm.
potential of winning more. There was making memories with my friends. There's often free drinks, right? That maybe even pay for, they're kind of crappy drinks, but like it pays for the amount that you're losing.
Something.
But you're walking in there, hoping to sort of bet something, but
Yeah.
you're okay with the downside.
Yep.
This is compared to what most people think entrepreneurs do, where they're like, I'm going to make $1 billion company and I'm going to bet the entire farm and go homeless, right? Uh,
Yeah.
in the pursuit of the small chance that I might get that.
Yeah.
Really focus on that downside risk that you're taking. And hey, if you take a step forward and you realize, wow, that was okay. I'm okay putting in, another like, 10 hours a week or, having another 5 hours of conversations with potential customers, right?
Hmm.
That's how you sort of take the step-by-step way towards more sustainable and maybe even wildly successful entrepreneurship.
Yeah. I mean, like, I always say on this podcast, one of the things we're doing is trying to expand the amount of stories that people hear because I'd say the primary story, which is a fine story for a certain subsection of the population, is you graduate high school, you go to college, maybe you get an advanced degree, and then you land the job. And again, that works for some people, but in the United States with 365 million people, chances are it doesn't work for everybody. I would argue the second, the story that comes after that in terms of popularity is what you mentioned. Is we always hear about these people that blew up really big, and there is, I'm going to argue that there's romanticism involved, and like I gave everything to this, I risked everything, like it was this or nothing, and now I'm here, and that's how I did it. Which again
Yeah.
has probably worked for some people, but I would argue it's not going to work between those two stories. It's not going to work for the 300 and I say 65 million people in the United States and then beyond in the world. Sounds like what you're saying is, you're just kind of having to check yourself. You have to figure out, as you mentioned, at this step, what am I able to lose? And like, am I cool taking another step or do I got to pivot?
No, that's right. I think what you're describing there, people call survivorship bias, where you're only going to hear from the people who have made it, who they only had one shot at it, and so that was their only experience. Maybe it
Yeah.
was they did bet the farm and they got successful, but for all the people that didn't make it, the many more people that didn't make it doing that, they're not the ones on stage giving you advice.
Yep.
And I would
Yeah.
say that the people who you typically see this in like the high risk, high reward businesses, the VC backable businesses. And as
Hmm.
someone who is a VC, right, the first thing I actually tell people beyond after like go get a customer, right, go show me there's real demand here, is hey, don't take money from investors unless you need to, right? Try to make
Mm.
this like a sustainable business where you have full control and you make this thing happen, right? But if you find that it's growing real fast and if you had just like a little bit of money, you could 10x that investment up for someone, like great. Like that's a great investment. That's what investment
Yeah.
is. You don't just raise money because you happen to be a startup. But we get
Hmm.
this in popular culture because it's romantic. We got Shark Tank where
Yep.
everyone's trying to raise money from the royalty that's on the throne who are able to give some money to the business.
Yeah.
Uh, and like the VCs, industry, it's incentivized to be self-promotional. You have to be
Hmm.
shamelessly promoting what you're doing as a VC and all of the amazing heroes that you're backing who are changing the world. That's how you get more investors to invest in future funds.
Hmm.
But this has a major detriment on what actual entrepreneurship looks like.
Yeah. Well, I think this ties into the next point is like, this idea of, whether or not it's worth somebody getting backed by a venture capitalist, but also is it worth for them, getting an MBA or even going to college to begin with, or like determining, is it worth that next step? I think you touched on the VCs, but I mean, as far as like advanced degrees or college degrees to begin with, and anywhere else you want to take this, like are those things? Do you think those things are worth for people?
It probably depends on their situation. What is their set of options, and what are they interested in doing moving forward? Let's take the advanced degree because I have one. Again,
Mm-hmm.
if you had asked me as an engineer if I wanted to go get an advanced business degree, number one, I didn't want to be in school ever again. Actually, I was a kid at the front of the room, always raising my hand because I wanted to engage with the professor instead of like be in a classroom again.
Yeah.
Business, I already told you what my opinion on business was from the beginning, right? And so I think I applied late to business school, and it was
Mhm.
almost like comically irresponsible, how it happened, right? But again,
Mhm.
there's when you're the one going after something, there's a thread through your life where you're going in a direction, and the MBA happened to be one of the things for me. So I say to people, if you're going to get like an MBA for the education itself, you can read that in a book. In fact, there's a great one called the 10-Day MBA that was written by a Darden alum that's got all the facts in there on how you do
Yeah.
accounting and like financial management and like discounted cash flows. It's all in there.
Yeah.
But I think you go to these like a graduate program, for instance, to be in a cohort of peers that are at this advanced stage. If you were fortunate enough to go to an undergrad program, right, you had this cohort that you were with and got to be experience life with. Well, after undergrad, you're kind of out there on your own.
Yeah.
And I think that it can be important, go back to grad school and be around other people of advanced learning who have similar interests, right? Who
Mhm.
can be there with you. You develop a network, right, with real experiences. The way we were taught the MBA was like case studies. So I did get exposed to a lot of discussions and different perspectives that were out
Mhm.
there. Sometimes, as cynical as it is, the credential of having the extra letters behind your name, I'm sure that many people backed me in what I'm doing now because of the credentials behind my name, even though like
Mhm.
I don't know if it really added that much more like real credibility and able to do what I'm doing.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, so what I'm trying to say is it depends, but it's often the indirect things that are resulting rather than what you think is like the direct result, which might be like education in terms of the
Yeah.
MBA.
I
Yeah.
mean, isn't that the common theme of what we're hearing though? Is like there's unpredictable circumstances that happen with each step that you take, and
Yeah.
if you're open to accepting those, that's what could lead you into some wild directions.
And it goes into that affordable loss thing. Like, are you willing to take on the risk and lose everything if it doesn't work out? Um, are you okay with that? So like, going to grad school, it's not cheap. Like it does cost money, right? So are
Hmm.
you able to front that and get like, a normal job or something like that, even having, is it still worth it?
Hmm.
Or could you get a scholarship or a partial scholarship to be able to go after that? And would that change your thinking on this?
Hmm. Well, I think as far as like determining if each of these steps is useful for an individual, there's like a lot of know thyself that seems
Yes.
to have to go on before you commit to one story or the other. Do you have any advice for people to be able to say like, hey, here's how you can organize where you're at in your life? I mean, I don't think a lot of people talk about that.
Yeah. So here's what I found. It's probably not the only or maybe the most correct answer, but it's what works for me. It goes back to the creativity discussion. One of the
Hmm.
core paradigms in the science of creativity is that during the creative process, you need to have a divergent phase where you diverge and a
Hmm.
convergent phase where you converge.
Yep.
And these need to be balanced and separated.
Hmm.
The problem is when most people think of creativity, they think of this divergent phase where you get a stimulus, think of like an improv show, like
Hmm.
pineapple, right? And then you come up with lots of different ideas or associations off of that stimulus that's out there. You get a challenge question like, how might we get a hippo out of a bathtub? And then your
Hmm.
mind starts coming up with lots of ideas and possibilities that are there. That's great and all, but you need to balance that and separate it. Don't do it at the same time. Meaning, don't judge the ideas coming out, but you balance and
Hmm.
separate that with the convergent phase, where you evaluate each possibility, right, according to some criteria. You err on the side of like positivity, like what might be the opportunities in some of these
Yep.
crazy ones that are out there. Um, and maybe you consider novelty as a way of looking at that, right? So you have this
Hmm.
like convergent phase that we're almost like overtrained in. If this was like the convergent bicep and this was the divergent bicep, this one would be a lot bigger than this one.
Yeah.
That this would be like a thin rail, just like bone. So why am I talking about this in this question? Good question there. Is is that I think that in the world today we have so much coming at us, so much information, which is awesome, that we're
Hmm.
always in this divergent mode. We're always seeking and
Yep.
searching more. We have stuff coming at us. We have noise in our ears with the headphones, and not to sound like a boomer, right? But like there's just so much coming at us
Yeah.
that like I don't think that young people are taught that they should be reflecting and going into
Hmm.
converge mode about their own lives. And
Hmm.
so the first time you try to do this, you try to reflect back, meditate, do stream of consciousness writing, do a time journal, all that. It can be
Hmm.
really time consuming and awful. But if you make it a habit where you're doing it once a quarter, once a year, yearly reflections, maybe even once a week, right?
Hmm.
Where you're just sort of taking what you learned that week and seeing how it changes your perception of what you're doing, who you are, what you like. If you do that on a regular basis, you're going to be a lot more in tune with the things
Yeah.
that you know are good for you. And it'll allow you to make these decisions quicker. So,
It's
given that most of the audience is probably not doing this on a regular basis, if you find yourself at a crossroad, like I did, where actually I had to choose between going to get an MBA and continuing to be with this company that got funded by Y Combinator, right? Amazing opportunities. I
Mhm.
had to sit down and over a period of 2 weeks, really like figure out like which one I actually wanted to do and why. What are the reasons why I was trying to do both of them?
Yeah.
Um, if you can succeed in doing this fast on a regular basis, definitely let me know because you will be the pinnacle of human potential right there.
Well, it's so funny that I'm hearing like these common threads, and I'll bring this up again. I have this belief system that God, the universe, whatever your belief system is, will speak repetitively if it wants you to hear something, right? And a couple folks I've talked to have touched on something similar, which is, if you sit down and you write out these goals or these ideas or these pieces of yourself and you get them on paper so that way you can analyze them, so that way everything just kind of comes out, it does this miraculous service to you by helping you again point yourself in a certain direction. I find, and I forget who mentioned this because this is not an original idea by me, but somebody had said that it's through speaking or writing that we're able to organize our thoughts. Like there's so much going on up here. So by getting it on paper, that allows us, to be able to diverge onto paper. It allows us to converge on the things that, we need to be focusing on.
That's exactly right. And one of my first, if people ask me to recommend them something that they could do, the first thing I send them is something called Morning Pages from Julia
Mm.
Cameron. She wrote a book called The Artist's Way, and if you read that and you're not used to some of the woo-woo stuff that's out there, you're gonna be like, "Whoa, what is this?" But I assure you, it is the best book for you to start to sort your life out.
Mm.
But Morning Pages is this thing that Julia Cameron would do with all of her clients. They're
Mm.
mainly artists and writers and all that to help them get unblocked, to get past that
Mm.
creative block, like writer's block and all that. And she would say, "You need to do this. If you're not doing this, you're no longer my client." Right? So
Mm.
there's some impetus there.
Some
But
some boundaries, yeah.
yeah, the idea was that for 30 minutes every single day, ideally in the morning when you're not going to overschedule that with something, you just write whatever comes to mind, even if
Mm.
it's I don't know what to write. I don't know what to write. There's nothing in my head, right? But eventually you start to be like, oh, I think I need to get my laundry, or that's an interesting bird that's outside, or my stomach hurts, or I'm
Yeah.
hungry, right? What's magical is like maybe 15 minutes in, maybe not the first time you do it, but eventually 15 minutes in, you get to that halfway epiphany where something that's been
Mm.
bouncing around your mind for a long time just like comes out and you just start to like write out everything on the paper. And even if you don't consciously do the converging part, right? Maybe you'll be in the
Mhm.
shower, maybe you'll be driving, be doing dishes or swimming or something like that. Any place where you can't write stuff down, your mind will be like, oh my God, I got to do this now. It becomes crystal clear.
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
if nothing else, do stream of consciousness writing, where
Huh.
the only thing is you don't judge what's coming out. Just get it out there onto the page.
That's brilliant. I love that. I love that. Like that is a perfect example, and even in like I'll call it the traditional arts, and I'm using that in quotes for folks who are not watching this, right? So like music and painting, so many of those start as like just thumbnails, right? They're very low cost. You just bang a bunch of ideas out, and then through that you're able to let those percolate and let those marinate in your head and see where they go. So I know we're approaching the hour, so I don't want to take up too much more time. But there's a couple more points that I wanted to touch on, and you had mentioned, I think, two more things that were really interesting, and they deal a lot with these human relationships. One, negotiation as the most important skill, and then two, relationship cultivation as a key driver of success. And how people use this term community, and whether or not we're even really using it the right way. It seems you wrote a little bit about these concepts as well.
Yeah, and apologies, they're kind of all over the place because I'm trying to still figure out how they, in a logical format fit together. Hopefully you'll be able to figure this out. Negotiating skill is, to go back to the MBA, probably the most important thing I learned in the program. We had a class where I got to learn frameworks about negotiation. Now, you can learn that on your own. You don't need to be in a program to do that.
Hmm.
But if you think about it, what is negotiating? Negotiating is figuring out where you stand, what you believe, what you want, and going into an interaction where you're trying to enter a partnership with somebody else who ideally also knows what they want and where they're going, and you guys coming together for an agreement that makes both of you better, both parties,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Well, that is what I've described as entrepreneurship, right? You start with
Yeah.
you go out there and you get commitments from people. Every commitment
Mm.
is some sort of negotiation. So if you're going through the world, so sorry, number one, first of all, getting that commitment, figuring out where the agreement zone is, and like separating positions from interests.
Hmm.
Um, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into that. You should read Getting Yes, which is an
Okay.
old, you can get it used for like $1 online, right?
Yeah.
So all those things are great. But really, you need to go in there knowing yourself to be able to understand where and when you can concede on certain things and
Mm.
what you really just can't budge on. And
Hmm.
so you know that like entering into an agreement may be worse than not entering into one at all. So
Mm.
I think that negotiating is a really powerful skill for entrepreneurs to understand who they are and what they have and how they can meaningfully enter into commitments with customers, with investors, with employees, with suppliers, with yeah, all sorts of people, all of the stakeholders that are out there. So that's negotiating.
Mm. It's I'm seeing another common theme here, which is like this ability to let go of an expectation,
Yeah.
right? By knowing where you're at. If you know what you need or don't need from any situation, you're more willing to let go of maybe an idea that wasn't the best idea. You're more willing to let go of a negotiation that may not work out. And I'm thinking, on the flip side of that, how many people being in, I'll call it a desperate situation or maybe too eager of a situation to become quote unquote the entrepreneur, um, begin to put themselves and hold on to these scenarios or interactions or relationships or ideas that are ultimately just weighing them down.
Oh, you're right. So, again, back to the idea thing, having that initial idea, it's almost 100%, fundamentally flawed in some way.
Hmm.
The best ideas are almost like they're emergent properties, of like two or more individuals getting
Hmm.
together and entwining their destinies. I
Yeah.
told you this is going to get really, really woo-woo over there. And when I was teaching Intro to Entrepreneurship, we would teach this case about the Pandora founder. Remember Pandora
Mm.
Music where they had the
Yeah,
human
yeah, yeah.
genome project?
Yeah.
Well, and this is just one interpretation, right? But the Pandora founder was very much locked into this idea, this like beautiful ideal of being able to actually do this music genome project. But the way
Hmm.
in which the company ended up moving forward, they weren't able to generate the cash flow and grow to actually
Hmm.
pay for what was necessary. They had a bunch of like trained classical artists and musicians like tagging each one of these songs
Yeah.
individually, and it just ended up being awful. And they actually forewent multiple opportunities, including I think the ability to add in a kiosk at Best Buy for someone to like find CDs that they're looking for, back in the day, which would have
Yeah.
powered on this more like
Hmm.
higher ideal. But they forewent that, and maybe other opportunities that came their way to make a sustainable business. So it got to the point where they had to take what was probably a very predatory investment from a VC firm to bail them out and get the company going. And they
Mm.
were ultimately sold off to I forget which company bought them, which was a large figure on paper, but when you really look at it and read between the lines, the founder probably didn't get much at all,
Mm.
right? And so, yeah, you can enter into these commitments with other people that they may seem good, but they don't actually make you better off at the end of the day. So,
Mm.
anyway, so yeah, that's an interesting case there. And then moving back to your relationship idea, as you can
Hmm.
tell, I consider entrepreneurship not necessarily the process of validating a solution to a problem that maybe we learned in engineering and maybe you use as a product manager. I
Yep.
consider entrepreneurship the act of cultivating relationships and
Mm.
figuring out where we can work together and commit to each other in ways that
Mm.
benefit all of us. And so the idea of community, most people will use it to say like, oh, my audience that's here, or people on a Slack group, or student entrepreneurs in an entrepreneurship club that are kind of interested in what's going on. That's not really a community if you just have a bunch of people in a room who don't know each other.
Yeah.
When I talk about community, I think that the strength of a community is based on the strength of each one-to-one relationship in that community.
Yes.
And that
Yes.
by strengthening each one of those, having conversations like this, right?
Hmm.
The more that we do that with each other and see each other as individuals, the stronger our collective community actually becomes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like it's in a way you do things that aren't scalable, right? It's not
Yeah.
about just building this, oh, I have this channel of tens of thousands of users, or members or whoever, but how many of those folks are you sitting down with and getting a coffee or talking to, figuring out their philosophy, figuring out what their journey's like. And, there is this, again, going back to this concept of, well, are you going after this metric that was originally a measurement of the core quality happenstance that created something beautiful? Or are you trying to do the original, uh, I don't know, the original objective that ended up having this metric in the background for some whatever reason? And I think, what you're getting at with the community is like, well, yeah, to build a community, you have to talk one-on-one with people, and you should be generally interested in learning with them. And then who knows where that's going to go? But you could have 10,000 people. I mean, we see it on social media all the time where people like pay for followers, and it's like nobody interacting with their stuff because that does not necessarily mean that they're having quality interactions. The number does not correlate to quality.
That's right. That's exactly right. So again, it comes down to these people, right?
Yep.
Community, relationships, and working together in ways that like the act of working together, the process of doing it is really where the magic is, and it's more likely to lead to sustainable success.
100%.
Listen, I didn't really realize we were gonna have a philosophical conversation, but this is awesome.
Like, I this is what happens. I come from the humanities, and I think everybody does. Like, I think people are inherently curious. And going back to what you had mentioned about the original academy, right? Students learning from other students. I think the beautiful thing about having, these one-on-one conversations with people of all different walks of life is, the way that I think about it is everybody in their sphere of life covers a certain domain, a certain area of everything that life has to offer. And the more people that we talk to, the more we begin to see, like, yeah, everybody has their unique space in that, but there's a lot of overlap. And from overlap, you begin to see patterns. And from patterns, you can almost gain this context as to what it really means to be an entrepreneur, or, be a scientist, or be a Marine or a firefighter or a product manager. You begin to see these common threads and just getting woo again. I'm going to quote The Alchemist, but like the language of the world. And I think that's what's amazing is if we come together as people, and not necessarily try to check boxes, but just be very curious about, well, how did everybody get to where they're at? You're going to start seeing, I think, more of those amorphous objectives begin to come out of that, but you begin to be more comfortable with them as well.
Yeah, I mean, as much as a logical engineer that I am, building stuff, that alchemist, the what is it that when you want something bad enough, the universe will conspire to make sure that you get it, something like that.
Yep.
Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
that's faith, right? That's a blind faith I'm talking about. Julie
Yep.
Cameron says very similar things. Is that if you take the first steps, she calls it the great creator, which the
Hmm.
universe will basically carry you the rest of the way. But if you're not
Hmm.
taking those first steps, you're not doing the initial work, then you're not going to go anywhere with there.
Yep.
So
100%.
yeah.
This has been amazing, Alex. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. You've got some great questions that are there.
You got some great questions as well, and great answers. So thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you. Before we sign off, I know you had mentioned that people can find you on LinkedIn.
Yeah, it's probably the best one. I try not to have any other social medias, but like LinkedIn is very
Yes,
powerful professional platform.
100%.
But if you're going to connect with me, send me a note in the connection request. There's nothing
Okay.
worse than a random person I don't know being like, "Hey, let's connect." And I'm like, "Who is this person?
Who are you?
I don't know this person. Why are we connecting?" Right?
Yeah,
Either I met you in person or like there's a reason why, we want to connect. So,
100%. And so they can find you at www.linkedin.com/in/a Zorychta, and that's spelled the entire thing, Azorychta.
that's right. That's right. So if you can spell that, that's the first test. Uh,
Couple of folks with some crazy last names on this podcast today. So of
That's right. That's right. Well, cool. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I hope this sparks
course.
many, many future conversations amongst your audience members and for your future podcast guests.
I appreciate it. Thanks for coming on. And for those listening, I appreciate you listening to this episode of Oddly Successful. And as always, if you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving us a review. Doing so allows us and Alex to reach more people. And for those who may benefit from hearing Alex's story, among the many stories that are out there, you're going to help, Alex reach those folks, and hopefully put them on the path that they're meant to go. So as always, I believe we should encourage people to strike out and do what they were put on this earth to do. And I appreciate you listening. So we'll see you next time, and stay weird, folks.
Thank you.